Yesterday was the deadline for the U.S. Congress to secure the futures of hundreds of thousands of dreamers. Our constituents who grew up in the United States, have been here at least 10 years, but do not have permanent legal immigration status and therefore are deportable, vulnerable, and exploitable. And guess what? The cynics were right, and Congress has taken no action. There have been a few attempts, but the reality is that Congress has not passed a bill, and the opportunities for us to pass a bill are dwindling. How did we get here? How is it that we always end up here when it comes to immigration? Well, it is both a failure of both parties to act, to compromise, to legislate. But let's be honest, the president doesn't want these immigrants in this country, and Republicans in Congress only want to do what the president wants them to do because they fear his tweets and the effect they might have on their voters in November. Oh, the president said he loved dreamers. Remember? He wanted to preserve DACA, to treat them with heart. He said he wanted to give a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. He told a group of lawmakers on national television that he would take the political heat and sign whatever bipartisan approach they were able to come up with. But he was lying again. Just like his conversation with lawmakers on guns after the massacre in Florida, also with the television cameras rolling. What the president says in public, what he does behind closed doors, what he tweets, and what he thinks from moment to moment do not seem to be connected in any logical way. And when the cameras are turned off, the radical right wing whispers their orders in the president's ear, and he falls right in line, whether it's with gun manufacturers or the anti-immigrant nativists. And when you cannot trust the president to have a stable opinion for more than 2, maybe 3 hours, it makes it hard for Republicans to figure out what will please him and make him happy from moment to moment. Bipartisan proposals that could have passed the House and the Senate were brought to rejected them, saying that he wanted to eliminate various types of legal immigration avenues used by people, especially people of color and people from the developing world. And without these massive cuts to illegal immigration, the president just wasn't interested. And we offered him money for his silly, mindless, stupid, dim-witted, racist wall, but he rejected that too. In the end, this is not about dreamers. It's not about the wall. It's not about border security. It's not a, you know what it's about? It's about a deeply held core belief of the president and many of his advisors that just too many people of color coming legally to the United States. There are too many family members of immigrants, unless those immigrants are members of Trump's own family. It is clear that the president doesn't want immigrants who look like the diverse and colorful fabric of the world. And he doesn't want dreamers who were raised in the U.S. alongside of our own children who reflect the diversity of America. Now, to be fair, some of my Democratic colleagues are just as happy about the injunctions in the federal courts that are keeping the Trump deportation machine from fully engaging and going after dreamers. Lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, don't need much encouragement sometimes to just kick the can down the road. But let's not kid ourselves. Relying on the courts to save dreamers is a cop-out, and a lot of people are left out if they do not already have DACA. And for the ones who can renew their status, we may be back here in a few days or weeks trying to prevent the deportation of dreamers and lots of other immigrants if the courts change course, which they may. So, I will not let my colleagues in either party rest. For now, every person who has DACA should renew their DACA as quickly as possible for whatever time they have left. I say run, don't walk, to renew. I've been here long enough to know that even when faced with an issue on which 80% of the American people agree, whether it's sensible gun control or preventing the deportation of children raised in America, it's the 20% of the American people who Republicans are listening to and playing to and tweeting to and playing nice with the White House to appease. So, and the rest of us, what do we get? Nothing on immigrants, on guns, on climate change, on health care, or on taxes. Unless as voters, we simply reshuffle the deck.
Gentleman yields back. Member